Warren Leck didn't use the gate latch. He lifted it with one thumb and let himself in, which told Faye Dunnmore everything she needed to know about him before he said a single word. She was on her knees at the base of the water tank, trying to reseat a corroded fitting she'd ordered from the hardware store 3 days ago, and had been carrying in her jacket pocket ever since. She heard the boots on the gravel, 2 sets behind his. She didn't stand up right away. Miss Dunnmore. His voice had the particular steadiness of a man who rarely had to raise it. I think we should have a conversation. She set the fitting down on the edge of the tank and turned around. Warren Leck was maybe 60, broad through the chest, wearing a canvas jacket with his operations brand stitched on the breast pocket. He held a manila envelope under his arm, the way people hold things they expect you to reach for. She didn't reach. She was 29 years old. She had $47 in her checking account. She had 7 sheep that the man at the feed store had already told her twice were the wrong kind. She had a water tank that wasn't working, a house that smelled like old newspaper, and a degree she'd put on hold for the 2nd time in 3 years. She looked at him. "Get off my property," she said. That Tuesday morning in early April is where the real story begins. The letter had arrived on a Thursday in late February. Faye had been between shifts at the hospital. She worked the floor as an aide, mornings, and cleaned offices 3 nights a week when she found it in her mailbox. The return address was from an estate office in Tallow County, a place she'd driven through once as a kid and hadn't thought about since. Her great-aunt Bet was dead. Faye had known Bet Dunnmore the way you know a photograph on a wall. A small, angular woman in her father's old pictures, standing next to a fence somewhere, squinting into sun. Her father's aunt, really. A woman who'd sent Christmas cards until Faye was about 12 and then stopped, and no one in the family had seemed to notice. She was her mother's uncle's. No. She was her father's mother's youngest sister. Faye had never worked it out exactly, and now it didn't matter. She read the letter twice leaning against the hallway wall of her apartment building. Then she read it a 3rd time sitting on the stairs. 61 acres in Tallow County, a farmhouse, 1 outbuilding, 7 sheep, and, printed on the 2nd page, in plain legal language, $38,000 in outstanding debt attached to the property, with bank foreclosure proceedings already in motion. She called the estate attorney's office the next morning. A man named Gerald, who was patient in the way people are patient when they've already prepared for the call to be short, told her she had approximately 5 months before the bank moved forward, assuming she accepted the inheritance. "What happens to the sheep if I don't accept?" she asked. A pause. They'd be considered property of the estate, liquidated with the rest of the assets. She said she'd call him back. She drove out to Tallow County 2 days later, before she'd made any decision, because she needed to see it first. She left at 5 in the morning to get back before her afternoon shift. The last mile of road turned from asphalt to gravel to something that wasn't quite either. She parked where the road gave up and walked. The 61 acres were mostly hillside, steep, rocky, full of scrub juniper and bunch grass, the kind of land that looked rough and felt rougher underfoot. Everyone she'd spoken to in town so far had called it the hard ground without any particular meanness, just as a description, the way you'd describe a chair as uncomfortable, a statement of fact. She heard them before she saw them. Not loud, a sound somewhere between a bleat and a breath, coming from behind a low stone outcrop near the far fence line. She followed it. The 7 sheep were clustered in the thin morning shadow of a rock wall, watching her arrive. They were small, smaller than she'd expected, with short legs and dense, layered fleece the color of weathered wood. Their horns curved close to their heads, and their eyes were amber and direct and unusually calm for animals she'd never met. They didn't scatter when she got close. They watched. One of them, the smallest actually, a compact ewe with a dark patch across her left shoulder, walked toward Faye and stood 3 feet away and regarded her with the concentrated attention of something that has decided you are worth evaluating and has not yet reached a conclusion. Faye held still. The ewe took 2 more steps. Faye put her hand out, palm down. The animal pressed the top of her head against Faye's knuckles, held it there a moment, and then simply stood. "Okay," Faye said to no one in particular. She called Gerald back from the parking lot of a gas station in town and said she was accepting the inheritance. She gave notice on her apartment at the end of March. She deferred the last 20 credits of her nursing degree and sent an email to the program coordinator that she did not reread before sending, because if she reread it, she wouldn't send it. She packed everything she owned into her truck, which had a rear wheel bearing that needed attention, and moved into a dead woman's farmhouse in the first week of April. The house smelled like cedar and something that was probably pipe tobacco, and definitely was mildew in the northwest corner of the back bedroom. The kitchen faucet ran rusty for 3 minutes before it ran clear. The wood stove worked. One window in the main room had been taped with clear plastic over a cracked lower pane, and the tape had yellowed but was still holding. She spent her first evening on the porch steps with a notepad, writing down everything that was wrong in order of urgency, and then she made a second list of everything she had to work with. The second list was shorter. It still existed, and that was something. The water tank problem she found on her second morning. The fitting had corroded, and the flow was down to a trickle. She ordered the replacement part and paid for expedited shipping with money she didn't have, and went into town to carry the sheep's water by hand while she waited. The man at the feed store was named Boyd Ingram. She'd learned that from the sign above the door. He was maybe 55, heavy-set, with the kind of authority that comes from being asked questions in the same room for a long time. He helped her load grain into the truck without being asked, which she appreciated, and then told her without being asked that the sheep she had were Soay, an old British breed, and that nobody in Tallow County ran Soay sheep for a reason. Too small, he said. Wool's too coarse for commercial grade. Meat yield's not there. Pretty animals, but they're not practical animals. I know what Soay sheep are, Faye said. She'd spent 4 nights reading. He looked at her, the way people look at someone who said something they weren't expecting. Then you know what I'm telling you. I know what you're telling me, she said, and loaded the last bag herself. She could feel him watching her drive away. She met Renata Sobel on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of April, when Renata appeared at the property line without announcement, which, Faye had already learned, was simply what people did out here, and stood at the fence watching the sheep for a long time without speaking. Renata was old, not politely old in the way that accumulates weight and texture, the way old stone does. Somewhere between 70 and 85, small, with white hair cut short and pale eyes that didn't waste time on anything they weren't actually looking at. She carried a walking stick she clearly resented needing. Faye came up beside her and waited. They're in good condition, Renata said, still watching the animals. Her accent was faint but present. Eastern European, Faye thought. For now, Faye said, I'm still figuring out the nutrition side. Renata made a sound, not dismissive. More like someone acknowledging an answer that's more honest than most. How many generations has your aunt had them? I don't know yet. I found some notebooks in the house. I haven't gone through all of them. Renata looked at her sideways. Go through them. She didn't stay long. She walked the fence line once, slowly, stick planted at each step. She looked at the hillside, at the rocky ground, at the way the bunch grass grew thick and uneven in the places where the slope changed angle. At the fence, she stopped and looked back at Faye. The ground everyone in this valley avoids, she said, nodding at the hillside. Soay sheep have been living on ground like this for 4,000 years, on the islands off Scotland. Nothing grew there but rough grass and heather, and they thrived. People here think the hillside is the problem, Faye said. People here think wet is bad and dry is good and flat is best. She said it without judgment, simply as information. They think rock is waste. They're wrong, but there's no point arguing it. You just have to let the land show them. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She didn't offer advice that wasn't asked for. She walked the fence. She watched the animals. She said things, occasionally, that Faye had to sit with for a day before she understood what they meant. What she never said, and what Faye only understood later, slowly, from reading between everything, was that she'd been watching the Dunnmore property from the road for 3 years, since Bet had gotten too frail to manage the animals herself. Just watching. Just knowing they were still there. The notebooks were in a tin box under the workbench in the outbuilding. 12 of them, going back 19 years. Bet Dunnmore's handwriting was small and precise, The handwriting of someone who'd grown up when paper cost money and space on it wasn't to be wasted. Faye read them over 4 evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the wood stove ticking. She had a cup of tea she kept making too strong. She'd always made it too strong, and she forgot to drink it while she was reading. Bet had known what she had. That was the thing. She wrote about the breed with a specificity that wasn't boastful, just factual. She tracked bloodlines, noted which ewes lambed easily and which needed watching, documented the way the flock moved across different sections of the hillside through different seasons. She wrote, in one entry from 11 years ago, the ground everyone calls useless is what keeps them. The hard things are always doing that, being more useful than they look. Faye read that sentence twice and set the notebook down. She went back to the Heritage Breed Registry website, and this time she found what she'd been looking for on the 4th page of results. A small note, barely 2 sentences. Active soy breeding populations in this region have declined significantly. Known registered herds, 3, with total registered breeding ewe count under 30. She read it 3 times. Then she looked at her 7 ewes through the window. The small one with the dark shoulder patch. She'd started calling her Pebble, against her better intentions, on day 9, was standing in the last of the afternoon light doing absolutely nothing, which was a thing Pebble did with total commitment. Faye wrote to the breed registry that night. The response came on a Friday. She stood at the kitchen counter reading it. The woman who wrote back was named Carolyn, and her language was careful in the way of someone who had been professionally careful for a long time. But even inside careful language, there were sentences with weight. Your photographs suggest animals of exceptional traditional type. And, at the end, if the herd is what we believe, you may be holding one of only 2 active registered flocks in the state. Faye put the laptop down. She went outside. Pebble was at the fence. You have no idea, Faye said. Pebble's ears moved. 2 days later, a truck came down the road. The driver was a man in his 50s, friendly smile, canvas vest, with the logo of an agricultural investment group she half recognized. He said he'd heard she had some old-type sheep. Said he'd like to take a look. Said it wasn't a buying trip, just curiosity. How did you hear about them? Faye asked. He smiled in the way that doesn't answer questions. Word gets around in small counties. You can look from the road, she said. He sat in his truck for 5 minutes before he reversed and left. Warren Leck came the following Tuesday. He lifted the gate latch with one thumb and walked in with 2 men she didn't know, and he had a manila envelope under his arm and a smile that had been placed rather than grown. He told her he knew about the debt. He told her it was a hard property in a hard market, and he'd hate to see her make things harder than they needed to be. He told her he was offering her a way out. Those sheep, she said, had 14 lambs this past spring through a registered Soay ram from the breed network in Montana. Every one of them is healthy and documented. Warren looked at her the way people look when they hear something in a language they don't recognize. Soay sheep don't produce. I know what you think they don't produce, she said. Get off my property. He left the envelope on the fence post. She didn't pick it up for 2 days. When she finally opened it, she sat at the kitchen table with the number and looked out the window for a long time. He was offering her the property at roughly 1/3 of assessed value, enough to clear the debt and leave her with almost nothing. The kind of offer you make to someone you expect to have no other choice. She folded it and called Carolyn at the registry. She asked what formal registration would mean, practically, what it opened up. Carolyn told her carefully, in the language of someone who had been burned before by raising expectations. Documented heritage lineage qualified for specialty designations. There was a federal rare breed conservation program, state level too. But the market side, there had been significant growth in the heritage fiber sector. Artisan textile producers, sustainable fashion brands. They paid at a different level entirely for animals with clean bloodlines and documented grazing history. How different? Faye asked. I've seen contracts at 4 to 6 times commercial wool pricing for exceptional provenance, sometimes higher. Faye stopped writing. She looked at the window, at Pebble doing her watchful nothing at the fence. What do I need to do to start the registration process? She said. The process was not fast, But Faye was beginning to understand that fast was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was whether you were still moving. She built a binder, physical, with tabs, organized chronologically. Bet's 19 years of notebooks first, then her own records from the spring. She added photographs, weight estimates, lambing notes, grazing observations, the way the flock moved across the hillside in a deliberate pattern she'd started to map. They grazed in overlapping arcs, returning to rested sections with an efficiency she could not have designed herself. The bank's formal letter arrived on a Monday in June. The foreclosure window was 55 days. She wrote it on the kitchen wall calendar and did not look at it again that day. She made a list instead. Things she could control on the left, things she couldn't on the right. She crossed out the right column, not because those things weren't real, but because looking at them was spending energy she needed somewhere else. She called the State Heritage Agriculture Office and left 3 messages before a woman named Dina called her back and said she might qualify under the rare breed conservation provision if the documentation was solid. How solid? Faye asked. Thorough, Dina said. They want to see it's genuinely significant, not just unusual. I have 19 years of notebooks, Faye said. My great-aunt's handwriting. A pause. That would be significant. Renata came on the following Saturday, and for the first time walked the hillside with Faye rather than staying at the fence. She asked about the grazing rotation, the supplemental feed, what Faye had noticed about the ewe's condition through the dry stretch. The drought had arrived in full by July. She could see it from the ridge above her property, the green leaching out of the valley floor, the cattle operations along the main road going pale. Her hillside stayed rough and full, not lush, just persistent, the same way it had probably always been, before anyone was paying attention. Your neighbors have flat land, Renata said, looking down at the valley. Irrigation systems, commercial feed schedules, 60 years of the same approach. She was quiet for a moment. This year, that approach has a problem. And my ground doesn't, Faye said. Renata looked at her. Just directly, the way someone looks when they think you're finally understanding something real. Your problem was always the debt, she said, not the land. Marcus Thies came in August. Renata had given her his name on a Thursday afternoon, standing at the fence the way she often did. He works with textile mills, sustainable fashion buyers, artisan producers, she said. He came to me last spring asking about heritage fiber operations in the region. I told him I didn't know of any active flocks. She looked at the sheep. I should correct that. Faye called him on a Monday with 3 index cards of notes in front of her. She described the herd, the documentation, the bloodlines going back to a registered Montana source. She mentioned Renata Sobel's name and heard the pause that told her he recognized it. She told him the flock had produced 14 healthy lambs in its first documented season, on land that had held through the summer drought better than anything around it. Silence. Then I'd like to come out. She looked at her index cards. The third one said at the bottom, underlined, "Do not sound like you need this." She read it. "I can make time," she said. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in September in a truck that was well used rather than new. He was maybe 45, lean, with the particular stillness of someone still in the process of deciding rather than having already decided. He shook her hand at the gate and looked at the flock for a long time without speaking. "Can I go in?" he asked. "Move slowly," she said. "Let them come to you." He moved right. He crouched when he got close, which was the right instinct, and Pebble, because it was always Pebble, walked toward him at her unhurried investigative pace and pressed her forehead against his jacket and stood there. He put his hand on her back. He stayed crouched for almost 2 minutes, not speaking, just looking at the animals and then at the hillside beyond them. She showed him the notebooks first. He read slowly, turning pages back, comparing entries. He asked 2 questions, one about a specific lambing notation in Bet's 4th notebook, one about the registered ram's documentation. She answered both. The second one she'd pulled the paperwork for in advance, because she'd expected it might come up. When he closed the last notebook, he looked at her. "You read all of these?" "Twice," she said. He nodded once. He went through her binder with the same methodical attention, the same unhurried checking of someone who'd been handed things before that looked organized and turned out not to be. When he finished, He set both things on the workbench and turned to face her. "Tell me how you understand the market for what you have." She told him honestly. Heritage fiber was niche but growing. The provenance of her animals, documented bloodlines, grass-based management on natural highland terrain, no commercial inputs, 19 continuous years of records, put her in a different conversation than commodity wool. She'd already had 2 fleece sales from the spring shearing at prices that confirmed the tier. She gave him the numbers. His face didn't move much when she said them. She took that to mean they were in the range he'd been considering. "What do you need?" he asked. 55 days ago I had a foreclosure proceeding," she said. "I now have 41. I need a contract with terms the bank will recognize as sufficient revenue to service the debt." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a short runway," he said. "I know," she said. He told her he needed to verify the bloodline documentation with a colleague, a heritage genetics specialist at the Agricultural Extension. A second visit within 2 weeks. If the verification held, he'd make her an offer. 41 days minus 2 weeks minus contract time. She did the arithmetic. It was tight. It was very tight. "Yes," she said. The genetics specialist came on a Thursday. Her name was Dr. Ingrid Halsey, and she moved through the flock the way a person moves through a place they know how to read. She spent the most time with Pebble and with the eldest of the registered ewes. A broad-backed animal, Faye, had been calling south for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She photographed, measured, cross-referenced something on her tablet, went back and looked at 2 things a second time with a different angle. "Your aunt's original animals," she said, not looking up. "Where did she acquire them?" "A closed operation in Dawson County, 2003. The registry documentation traces it." Dr. Halsey nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the Dawson herd was itself descended from the only direct importation of soy breeding stock from the island populations in this region. Late 80s, one of 2 such importations in this entire state. She looked at Pebble, who was watching her back. The other herd dispersed in 2011. Crossbreeding, mostly. Faye was very still. "What you have here," Dr. Halsey said, in the tone of someone stating a measurement rather than making an announcement, "is the only unbroken line from that original importation that I'm aware of in this state." She left that afternoon. Marcus called 4 days later. Faye was checking on the younger lambs in the outbuilding when her phone rang. She sat down on the edge of the water tank. He named a per-pound price for the fiber, then a contract term, then minimum annual volumes with provision for growth in years 2 and 3. She did the arithmetic in her head and then did it again, because the first time she thought she'd made an error. The annual revenue at minimum volumes was more than twice what she needed to service the debt, with room beyond that. Room for the cracked window, room for the corroded waterline she'd been watching deteriorate for 2 months, room to pay Boyd Ingram on time instead of on a prayer. "Those are real numbers," she said. She said it before she could decide not to. "Yes," Marcus said, "they are." She told him she'd need the contract to the bank by day 30. He said he could have a draft to her in 48 hours. She called the bank that evening. The contact there was a woman named Sherry, who had been professionally kind to Faye for months in the specific way people are kind to someone they expect will default. She gave Sherry the numbers. There was a pause longer than she expected. "Could you repeat the annual figures?" Sherry said. She did. Another pause, and inside it, Faye heard something change in the texture of Sherry's voice. The professional kindness recalibrating into something more like respect. The bank should be satisfied. The certified letter from the Tallow County Range Management Board arrived 9 days later. It cited a formal complaint, filed by an unnamed party, requesting a review of her grazing practices on the hillside property under Section 9C of the County Land Use Ordinance. The review window was 45 days. Her first contract delivery was in 32. She called Renata. "Warren Leck," Renata said before Faye finished explaining. "Not a question." "He sits on the board?" "Chair of the Grazing Review Subcommittee, 11 years. Faye sat at the table with the letter. "What does Section 9C actually require?" "Documentation of grazing rotation," Renata told her. "Evidence that the management practices were not causing erosion or overgrazing. Historical land condition records. I haven't changed anything, Faye said. Bet's notebooks document the rotation going back 19 years. I know, Renata said. And then, after a pause, I have something you should know about. She came over the next morning with a flat cardboard box. Inside were 2 surveys she'd commissioned on the boundary between her property and Bet's. One 7 years ago, one 12 years ago. Both included land condition assessments on the hillside. Both documented stable soil cover, low erosion indicators, healthy native grass density. Why do you have surveys of Bet's land? Faye asked. Because 11 years ago, the county tried to reclassify this hillside as degraded rangeland. If they'd succeeded, it would have triggered a mandated restoration process that would have made the property financially unworkable. She set the box on the table. Bet and I contested it. These are the records from that process. Faye looked at the box. You won? The county withdrew. She said it simply. Usually do when the documentation is better than theirs. Faye also called Dr. Halsey. She explained the situation honestly, the review, the timeline, what she could and couldn't pay right now. She asked whether Dr. Halsey would be willing to provide a professional assessment of the hillside's ecological condition as part of the compliance package. Dr. Halsey was quiet for a moment. I've been doing range assessments in this county for 14 years, she said. Warren Leck's operation requested a Section 9C exemption 8 years ago for a new grazing expansion. The board approved it in 10 days. A pause. I know what this review is. She came out on a Saturday. She walked every section of the hillside. She documented ground cover density, root depth at 5 sampling points, erosion indicators along the north face where the slope was steepest. She spent 40 minutes on the section the flock had used most heavily through the summer and wrote in her orange notebook for 20 minutes straight without stopping. When she finished, she sat on a rock at the edge of the slope and looked out at the valley. Your grazing rotation, she said, is functioning as soil restoration. The flock's movement pattern is rebuilding native grass density in sections that were thinning before your aunt's time. She closed the notebook. The county's own land health report from 4 years ago identifies this hillside as a candidate priority conservation zone. Your practices are contributing to that designation, not threatening it. She looked up. An inspection conducted honestly would not find a violation. It would find a model. Will you put that in writing? Faye said. I'll have a formal report to you in 5 days. She submitted everything together, Betta's 19 notebooks, her own season records, Renata's 2 surveys, the historical contest documents from 11 years ago, Dr. Halsey's assessment, and the state land records going back to 1962. The package was 3 inches thick. Then she organized the open farm day. She had 28 days left on the bank deadline. The first contract delivery was in 19. She put notices at the library, the feed store, the diner, the hardware co-op. She wrote, Heritage Breed Farm, registered soy flock, open to buyers, textile producers, neighbors, and anyone who wants to see what's been growing on the old Dunnmore hillside. No admission. Saturday, 9 to 1. The woman at the library, Ruth, who had been quietly friendly to Faye since April, put the notice in the front window without being asked. Boyd Ingram at the feed store read it for a long time before he pinned it to the board. You're really doing this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm really doing this, she said. He came on Saturday. He came at 9:10, before most of the others, and he walked the full property without speaking to her. He stood at the hillside fence for a long time looking at the flock. She watched him from across the yard and didn't interrupt. By 11, there were over 50 people on the property. People she knew and people she didn't. Ranchers from the valley, folks from the county extension office, a pair from the State Department of Agriculture that Dr. Halsey had apparently mentioned the event to. Marcus came, and he brought 3 people with him, a textile mill owner from Idaho, a sustainable sourcing buyer from Portland, a private producer who'd been looking for documented heritage stock for 2 years and had driven 4 hours. There were neighbors she'd never met. There was a family from the east side of the valley, Alan and Diane Coulter, 3rd generation on land that had been losing ground for 4 years, who stood at the hillside fence watching the flock with an expression she recognized. The kind people have when they're trying not to hope. Boyd Ingram found her near the outbuilding at noon. He waited for a gap in the conversation she was in. Those prices, he said. The fiber contracts, those are real numbers? Under contract, she said, yes. He was quiet. He looked at his boots, looked back at her. I've got a family, he said. Been running cattle on the North Ridge for 20 years. They're in a bad place. Ground's too rocky and steep for the herd they've got. He stopped. If someone were starting over with the right breed, the registry can connect them to registered stock, she said. The right breed for that ground exists. It's been existing on ground like that for a long time. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he nodded once. The Range Management Board closed the review 6 days later. The complaint was found to have insufficient grounds. The vote was 4-3. The chair, Warren Leck, was among the three. Sherry at the bank called that same morning. The contract terms were satisfactory. The foreclosure proceeding was halted. Faye was in the outbuilding when both calls came, 15 minutes apart. She sat down on the feed room floor after the second one, not dramatically. Her legs just decided that was where they were going, and she'd learned over 7 months to let her body make occasional decisions without requiring an explanation. She sat there with the smell of the barn around her and the November light coming through the board gaps. And Pebble appeared in the doorway, sniffed the feed room, assessed the situation, and walked back out, satisfied with whatever she'd learned. December brought the first snowfall and a call from Dina at the Heritage Grant Office. The rare breed conservation application had been approved, full amount. The committee noted the quality of the historical documentation, Dina said. 19 years of continuous records is something they don't see often. Faye sat on the porch steps in the cold. The snow came down thin and even, the kind that doesn't rush. She thought about Bet, a woman she'd never really known, who'd spent 19 years writing down what she had in small, precise handwriting in notebooks no one else was reading, because she understood something about patience that the valley hadn't caught up to yet. She called Renata that evening. Renata came for dinner on Saturday and brought bread she'd made herself, and they sat at the kitchen table long after the food was gone, the wood stove going, talking about the season and what spring would look like. Alan Coulter called in January. He and Diane wanted to know how to start. Faye told them to come out. They came on a cold Saturday morning in February, standing in her driveway with their hands in their jacket pockets, and the particular careful expression of people who had stopped expecting things to go right and hadn't yet decided whether it was safe to try again. Pete was 62. Diane was 58. Third generation on land that had been slowly breaking them back for 5 years. She showed them everything. Not the organized version, the actual version. The things she'd gotten wrong. The fencing mistakes, the winter nutrition adjustment she'd had to figure out by watching the animals lose condition before she caught it. She showed them Betta's notebooks and explained what each year of records had done when the range board came knocking. The North Ridge, she said. How steep? Too steep for cattle, Alan said. We keep trying to work the lower sections, but the soil's rocky. Dry looking, but it holds water underneath. We never understood it. That's not a problem, Faye said. That's your whole advantage. Diane looked at her, then at the flock on the hillside, then back. How long before it becomes something? Longer than you want, Faye said. Shorter than you think. She sold them 2 registered ewes from the season's progeny, below market, with conditions. Use the same documentation system. Share breeding data with the registry. Sell your own progeny to small operations in the valley at fair prices. Not to commercial buyers. Alan started to say something about the price. Let me finish, she said. 1 flock doesn't save a breed. And someone helped me when I had no reason to expect it. That's worth passing forward. She didn't explain Renata in those terms. Renata wouldn't have wanted that, but she thought about the Tuesday afternoon when a woman with a walking stick had appeared at her fence and said things she'd had to sit with for days before she understood them, about a cardboard box of surveys kept for 12 years just in case they were needed, about patience as a form of knowledge, and knowledge as something that doesn't disappear when the person holding it does, that it goes into notebooks, into the habits of animals that have been living on the same ground for 2 decades, and waits there. She called Renata that evening. I sold 2 ewes to a family on the North Ridge, she said. The Coulters. A pause. Coulterland, Renata said. His father used to farm that ground before Alan took it over. Good man. You know everyone in this county, Faye said. I've been here 30 years, Renata said. You accumulate people. Outside her window, the December light was going flat and silver across the hillside, the way light goes when the day has decided it's done. The flock was moving in the fading afternoon, doing the slow, deliberate arc across the upper section she'd come to recognize as the end-of-day pattern, methodical, unhurried, already working on tomorrow's ground. She was 29 years old. She had the largest registered soy flock in the state, 2 long-term fiber contracts, a conservation grant, 1 painted kitchen wall, and a wood stove she'd learned to bank correctly by her second week. She had 19 of her great-aunt's notebooks and 4 of her own. She had a neighbor who came to dinner on Saturdays and spoke in the particular deliberate language of someone who understood that most of what was worth knowing took longer than people wanted to wait. She had 14 lambs from last season and another cohort coming in spring, all documented, all accounted for, their bloodlines traceable in the registry to an island off the coast of Scotland, where the animals had been living on rough ground and cold wind for 4,000 years, long before anyone in this valley had decided what was practical and what wasn't. None of it had been clean. She'd been wrong about things and had to go back and be wrong again before she landed on right. The binder had corrections in it, crossed out estimates, entries she'd footnoted with reassess, whole pages representing a version of the problem she'd had to abandon. The mistakes were still in there. She hadn't removed them. An honest record was the only kind that actually helped someone else find the same ground later. She went inside. She made the tea too strong the way she always did. She sat at the table and opened Notebook 5 to a clean page. There were things to write. There were always things to write. The Coulters would need guidance through their first lambing, and the registry had asked if she'd speak at the spring meeting, and Boyd Ingram had already given her 2 more names. Families on the ridge with rocky ground and bad years behind them, and the tentative curiosity of people who were starting to wonder whether the thing everyone had told them was their problem might actually be their answer. She picked up her pen and started at the top.